I'm here to talk to you about Journalist 2.0. What is Journalist 2.0? I just came up with the idea because we know we have Web 2.0. Journalist 2.0 is to try and give you an understanding of what it is that is going to happen to you in the years ahead. The way I can read it, and I've been accused of being grey, having too many grey hairs, but I also was told the other day that you can't see grey on a white man, so that kind of helps a bit. I've been around since 1980. I started in newspapers in 1980, worked for the SABC in the good times, that was between 1991 and 1993, and then started Moneyweb in 1997. I worked at the Rand Daily Mail. That's why it was really lovely to see it walking in here. Wonderful newspaper. So I've had the experience of seeing how our industry has evolved. But I want to start off with a story from another industry entirely. I'm sure you've read, or I hope you've read, books by a guy called Malcolm Gladwell. Tipping Point. The best of them, I think, is there's one called Blink, which is very good as well, but the best of them, I think, is one called Outliers. Anyway, he's a wonderful journalist. He writes for New Yorker magazine. And if you want to go back and pick up this story that I think is very relevant for the discussion that I'm going to share with you this morning, he wrote it in October 2010 for New Yorker, and it's on the website gladwell.com. And the story involves a chap called Marvin Miller. Now, Marvin Miller is in his 90s. He still lives in Manhattan. And in 1966, he was appointed as the Secretary General, we would know it in today's terms, of the Major League Baseball Players Association. So he was the man who came from the Steelworkers Association, where he'd worked for the steelworkers fighting with owners, and he became Major League Baseball's representative. And he said he was frustrated out of to distraction because most of the players in the baseball leagues in those days came from small towns. And they thought it was just an honor and a privilege to be playing for the team that they played for, to be able to eat steak every night and to have thousands of fans cheering them on. They didn't realize their market value. And the owners of the baseball clubs were making money hand over fist, and the players had no medical aid, no pension. They had pretty poor wages, and if they got injured, well, that was tough. You know, you had a promising career and you end up a bum in Midwest America somewhere. So this gentleman, this guy called Marvin Miller, started applying policies that he had learnt while he was within the Steelworkers Association. And he started encouraging the baseball players to start looking for their true market value. There's a very famous quote that Gladwell uses of Marvin Miller, who went to, when the San Francisco Giants, who were a big baseball club at that time, came to town. He went and spoke to one of their players, one of their better players, a guy called Bobby Bonds. You can Google him too. And he said to Bobby Bonds, your son, your little guy who's standing there, his name was Barry, if he becomes a baseball player, he will earn more than every single person who's working in the Major League Baseball at the moment. And we know today that I support a very small little football club called West Ham United. Small team, like mid-table. West Ham is paying 500 million rands to secure one player, a guy called Andy Carroll. You see that the numbers that are going around for sports stars are kind of out of all proportion. Why do I use that story? Because that is what's happening to media. Media is going through a transformation which is very similar to what happened in Major League Baseball and pretty much all sports in the world from the 1960s onward. And it wasn't just sports. Corporate attorneys, corporate lawyers have gone from zero to heroes. Investment bankers today earn enormous amounts of money, and of course chief executives of companies. In the mid-60s, they were guys who retired with pretty little. The people who had the power back then were the owners of capital, and the owners of capital back then were pretty much people who had inherited it. So why has that got anything to do with media? The media industry until fairly recently, has been a place where there are extreme barriers to entry. When I started in journalism in 1980, you really had no option. If you wanted to be a journalist, you better hope like hell you could get onto the cadet course of then the morning newspaper group. If you didn't get on the cadet course, well, that was it. History. You could forget being a journalist. You could go to Rhodes, and I suppose you come to, I don't even know if Wits had a course at that stage, but you'd go to Rhodes, get a journalism degree, and probably end up in public relations. And we know none of you have actually come through or doing the studying that you're doing to end up in public relations, the dark side. Today, it's very different. Today, if you're talented, the only thing that is stopping you is your approach and your attitude. And the good news is we are seeing the superstar journalists emerging around the world. Tom Friedman, a columnist on the New York Times, is worth hundreds of millions of dollars because he wrote a couple of books, really good books. Lexus and the Olive Tree, The Earth is Flat. He also writes in the newspaper for Love. He's their foreign correspondent. Malcolm Gladwell, another good example, has written 4 books. If you want to get Gladwell to come and talk to you like I'm talking to you today for a 1,000 Rand gift voucher, hey? Gladwell will cost you $200,000. And he does it only when he feels like it. He doesn't have to. The superstar journalists have arrived in the same way as the superstar baseball players and the superstar athletes and investment bankers, etc. And that has happened because those barriers to entry that the media industry had have collapsed. The people who, in the past, wanted, I'll give you my story. I was in newspapers and decided, I've always been entrepreneurial, a lot like Kevin. I decided that I wanted to start my own business in 1988. So I did. And I had a restraint of trade. I was unable to publish in a traditional sense in my area of expertise, which has been financial journalism. It's what I've always done. So I started a horse racing magazine and found out the hard way about publishing. Well, first of all, you've got to get a distributor. I don't know what the situation is in South Africa today, but back then there were 2 distributors. And what the distributor said to you was, give us the publications, we will give you 50% of the cover price. So we sold it for 2 Rand, and for every one that was sold, they took a Rand, and they gave us back everything that was unsold. And of course, you had to print gazillions of these copies to try and get distribution somewhere. And then they took you if they wanted to take you. So you had a distribution cost. Then you had the other massive cost, which is printing. If you were, in other words, to start a business in the media industry back then, you either had to have government approval, and that meant a license. Some guys were very, very skellum, like 702. I laugh sometimes when I hear people talking about the Citizen newspaper. 702 came through the old BOP government. They got the BOP government license. Well, they were clever, they started, and good luck to them today. But you had a government requirement, and even today, none of us can start radio stations. We can start them on the internet, but we know that's not really working that well in this country yet. We would have to get licenses from the state, and that means lots of money. And I'm not talking about corruption and bribery. I'm just talking about putting the bid together to begin with. You have to have substantial amounts of cash. So the barriers to entry back then were absolute. So who made the rules? Well, the guy who's got the gold makes the rules if he's got the licenses. There was a chap who came to South Africa called Nduka Mbatengwa. He had This Day newspaper in Nigeria, still got it. He told me he dropped $25 million, US, proper money, on trying to start a newspaper in South Africa. Nduka came here, took about a year, didn't pay the staff when he left, but that is an example of what it took to get into this game. What does it take today? Biki Corp. And this is the big story of our age, is the battle between talent, which is people like us. I presume I'm still regarded as talent, even though I did start a business, and capital. And there's been these fights everywhere else in the industry, and because the barriers to entry have collapsed, that is a battle that is going on right here. So there are 2 things about it, good news and bad news. The good news is that those of you who are successful are going to make more money than you ever dreamed possible when you went to journalism school first. We don't go into journalism on the basis that we think we can make a lot of money, but it is still appalling to me that I see so many of my colleagues from over the years who end up destitute, cannot afford houses, and all the other social ills that go with it. The salary scales that were paid in the past were appalling. They're a little bit better today, but that is going to be very different in future. So that's the good news. Amongst you will be the next group of superstar journalists. The bad news is there'll only be a few of you. Until Pavarotti came along and started pressing his music on CDs, there were opera singers all over Italy. Any little town you went to in Italy, you would find an opera house with opera singers. Today, they're very few, because the best have risen to the top because of technology being the distribution of CDs. Journalism is very similar. Journalism is very similar. With barriers to entry, you could get hidden. I used to go to work. I worked on the Sunday Times. I was thanks, Bill Gates. I really didn't mean that. I worked on the Sunday Times, and I can remember many years ago in my misspent youth, I would go off to the Federal Hotel, which was the drinking hole of the journalists of the old Sign Group, and sometimes I would stay a little late, and the next morning I would cruise through the day, and nobody noticed. You can't do that anymore. You certainly can't do that if you're working for yourself, and increasingly people in our industry, if we're talented, will be working for ourselves. How do we get there? Well, the same way, I would urge you to think of a baseball player, or to think of a Van Persie, Robin Van Persie, one of the highest paid footballers, or Wayne Rooney, £200,000 a week. Even our, Benny McCarthy. You know what happened to Benny? He actually played for West Ham United. He was paid £40,000 a week. Okay? Call it R500,000, give or take a few cents. He was too fat to go on the field. He wasn't prepared to work. As a consequence, came back to South Africa, where our soccer is not quite as good, and he applied his talents here. But if you want to be a Benny McCarthy playing in the Premier Leagues, and there will only be place in journalism for people in the Premier Leagues, take that as a hint. Self-discipline. In my day, it didn't matter. People would sit in the pubs, and you could go into the newspapers because the barriers to entry were so high, competition was so low, profits were very high. You could afford to have. It was like who you knew, you got in the front door, you were made for life. That's not the case. Journalist 2.0 is a person who's going to apply themselves in the same way as any other talented professional would apply themselves. If you want to be like Benny McCarthy and eat too much and not train hard enough, you're going to get kicked out of the Premier League. And you'll have to apply your living in other ways, like the dark side. Dress appropriately. We as journalists think, well, that's cool. We can go in jeans and T-shirts, and, well, that's who we are. Well, that is who we could be in a time where there wasn't somebody around the corner taking our job. Now, it is who you are. You are in show business. You really are in show business, or very similar to that. Because talent is not there to be rewarded for simply showing up. Talent will be rewarded for what it produces. The other good news about all of this is that we now have the ability to reflect our talent. I've employed lots of people over the years, many people, and I do it differently. I would send out a letter or distribute before the days of email. Not many of you remember that, but I would put an ad in the paper and then see everybody, 80, 90 people for one job. Today, you would have, I suppose, a much easier way of doing things. But if you're one of those 80 or 90 people and you don't interview so well, the chances are you've got like a 1.5% or less than 1.5% chance of getting into the industry in the first place. That's not fair, because talented people generally don't interview well. It's the salesmen who interview well. So today, if you've got talent, what do? Well, you open your own website, which costs you $15 or $29 if you like, and have it hosted offshore. You get yourself a Twitter handle. You work hard on that Twitter account. You refer people to your website. And if you have talent, you will be recognized. But you will only make it as journalist 2.0, if you appreciate that the world, our world, has become one of the highest meritocracies on earth because of the way that the economics have changed. You can distribute widely, you can distribute your talents, you can showcase your talents today as you could never have done in the past. But by the same token, in the past where there might have been 100 jobs, in the future there will be 10. And those are the realities of what happened in every other industry which is going through what we're going through at the moment.